Today's aircraft technology provides reliability that pilots several years ago could not count on. But there are no guarantees. When an emergency arises, training and experience often make the difference between a successful outcome or a disastrous one. The pilot's operating handbook lists procedures to follow for engine failures, fires, electrical failures, and a multitude of other situations that require immediate action. But there are many other things that can go wrong. For example, lost communications, lost procedures, off-airport landings, and ditchings are all good examples of emergencies that require knowledge not normally included in the pilot's operating handbook. To improve your chances of a successful outcome of a bad situation, you must be prepared, which means being familiar with your aircraft's systems and performance capabilities. In addition, a multi-engine airplane is no more safe than a single-engine airplane if the pilot doesn't handle an emergency properly. In fact, some pilots may even argue that a single-engine airplane is safer than a multi-engine airplane because there are no choices to make and no adverse handling characteristics. If you lose your only engine, you simply must land. Other pilots oppose that view, saying that the redundancy and the ability to travel a longer distance or possibly maintain altitude on the good engine makes a multi-engine airplane safer. But whether you fly a twin or a single, a complete understanding of the systems and handling characteristics is imperative to your safety. There are some general things you can do to increase your chances of surviving an emergency. They are commonly referred to as the 4 C's. If possible, you should climb, communicate, confess, and comply. Since VHF communication is line of sight, climbing to a higher altitude will increase the range of your transceiver and navigation radios. Climbing also increases your chance of exposure to radar coverage and improves the direction-finding capabilities of flight service stations. Effective communication lets someone know of your situation and what your intentions are so they can help in whatever way is necessary. There is a set procedure for relaying the information required to handle an emergency. Your transmission should begin with the word Mayday or Pan Pan, preferably repeated 3 times. This will establish the emergency as a distress or urgency situation. Mayday indicates a distress situation requiring immediate action because of a threatening condition or serious danger. Pan Pan indicates an urgency condition. An urgency condition is a potential distress situation where there is a concern for safety requiring timely but not immediate assistance. Before anyone can offer any aid, you must confess to them your aircraft identification and type, the nature of the emergency, and your desires.
Duchess 18954. I have an engine failure. Request radar vectors to the nearest paved airport.
Additional information which may be necessary to handle your emergency varies depending on the situation. Try to report the observed weather in your area, your present position and heading, your altitude, the amount of fuel remaining in hours and minutes, the number of people on board, and other information that may be useful to ATC. If ATC requests additional information, don't worry about the promptness of your response. They'll understand if you're preoccupied with the situation and unable to provide information on demand. Your priorities are always the same: aviate, navigate, and then communicate. ATC is trained to handle emergencies and provide assistance. When they issue clearances, vectors, or recommendations, comply with them unless it will put you at further risk. You're still the final authority as to the safety of the flight. If you do not understand an instruction or are unable to comply for some other reason, Communicate this to ATC so they can clarify the instructions or issue a new clearance according to your needs.
Kansas City Center, Duchess 954, unable to maintain VFR on that heading. Request vectors around weather.
The frequency 121.5 is reserved for emergency use. However, if you're receiving assistance on another frequency, remain on it. ATC will issue a new frequency only if there's a valid reason. For instance, if you're leaving their area of coverage or a different facility is better equipped to deal with your situation. If you find it necessary to change frequencies, advise ATC of the change. If you're unable to receive a response from them, transmit in the blind the station name and frequency you're switching to. If ATC hears your transmission, they can then alert the new facility of your situation. Your transponder is also capable of limited communication through the use of assigned codes. 7700 is used for Mayday. 7600 indicates radio failure. And 7500 refers to hijacking or air piracy. However, if you're in radio contact with an air traffic control facility, continue squawking your assigned code unless requested to do otherwise. If you're not in radio contact, or if you have lost radio contact with the ATC facility, squawk Mayday on 7700 to alert ground facilities that something is wrong. If you can be picked up on radar, ATC will track your progress and alert search and rescue of your position if you don't make it to an airport. If you're approaching an airport, they will also alert the tower of the possibility of an aircraft in distress. However, this does not relieve you of see and avoid responsibilities. Specific situations may call for variations to these general procedures. Let's look at some examples of VFR emergencies that are not explained in most pilot operating handbooks. The first thing we'll look at is lost communications. Losing your radio can be a stressful situation, particularly in a high-density traffic area. If you suspect that your radios are inoperative, avoid airspace that requires a clearance. For instance, if you're approaching an airport traffic area, or TCA, you may have to alter your course to avoid the airspace. If practical, go to an area where there is less traffic and troubleshoot the problem. Be sure to continue looking for other aircraft. It's easy to get involved with the problem at hand and forget to see and avoid other traffic. There may not be a checklist for radio failure in your airplane, so take your time and systematically check to be sure you're on the correct frequency, that the volume and squelch are properly adjusted, and that the audio panel is set up correctly for the radio you're using. If you're wearing a headset, check to be sure the microphone, headset, and push-to-talk button are all plugged in. If this doesn't correct the problem, try using a different headset or the aircraft speaker and microphone. If you still can't contact anyone, try a different frequency or a different radio. When you're sure that your radios aren't working, evaluate your options. For example, if you plan to land at a tower-controlled airport, you may want to divert to a nearby non-tower controlled airport. When approaching the non-tower controlled airport, determine the direction and flow of traffic. Then enter the pattern as recommended by the Airman's Information Manual. Your transmitter may still be working, so announce your intentions in the pattern to make others aware of your position. Don't depend on this to ensure collision avoidance. Exercise extreme vigilance for other traffic and make a normal pattern in landing. Once on the ground, you can call the tower-controlled airport and make arrangements to enter the airport traffic area and land using light gun signals. They will probably give you the ATIS information and tell you how to enter the pattern, which runway is in use, and to watch for light gun signals on downwind. If you choose to continue your flight to the tower-controlled destination without stopping, remain outside or above the ATA and be sure that you don't enter any overlying airspace. Determine the direction and flow of the traffic pattern. Then enter the traffic pattern in the recommended manner and watch for the light gun signals. If your aircraft has a transponder, squawk 7600. If a radar facility picks up this squawk, they will most likely alert the tower of your problem. The tower will then give you light gun signals as you enter the airport traffic area. While in the air, a steady green light means you are cleared to land. A flashing green light indicates you should return for landing. This will be followed by a steady green at the proper time. A steady red light means you should give way to other aircraft and continue circling at the pattern altitude in a normal landing circuit. A flashing red light in the traffic pattern means the airport is unsafe and you shouldn't land. Exercise extreme caution is indicated by an alternating red and green light. Once on the ground, a flashing red light means taxi clear of the runway in use. A flashing green light indicates cleared to taxi. If the tower wants you to stop and hold your position, they will use a steady red light. An alternating red and green light means the same on the ground as it does in the air. Exercise extreme caution. Two other light gun signals you should be familiar with are: a steady green light on the ground indicates you're cleared for takeoff. And a flashing white light means you should return to your starting point on the airport. This signal will only be used when you're on the ground. To acknowledge a light gun signal, you should rock your wings in the air or move your control surfaces if you're on the ground. At night, blink your landing light or navigation lights regardless if you're in flight or on the ground. Another emergency you might encounter is getting lost. If you're fortunate, this won't happen to you, but most pilots have been disoriented and it can be a frightening experience. If this happens to you, one of the most important things to remember is to remain calm. Don't panic and don't make assumptions. Wandering around based on assumptions will probably make the situation worse. Don't head off toward a fix until you can verify that it is indeed the position you believe it to be. There are several ways you can reorient yourself. These include direction finder or DF steers, radar vectors, use of radio navigational aids, and pilotage. A DF steer is a direction finder service provided by flight service stations. Ground equipment necessary to provide DF steers includes a directional antenna, an azimuth display screen, and a radio receiver. Your aircraft only needs two-way radio communication capabilities. Direction finder services are based on magnetic bearings to and from the station. The bearing from the station is indicated on the scope each time you transmit. To request a DF steer, contact the FSS and tell them you're lost. If you don't know what frequency to use, 121.5 and 122.2 are available at all flight service stations. When informing FSS specialists of your situation, let them know your last known position and the approximate time and heading flown since crossing that position. The FSS will determine your bearing from the DF station during your transmission and give you a heading to fly, as well as the current altimeter setting and any other pertinent information for your flight. For example,
Warrior 81312, turn left, heading 330 for DF guidance to Akron VOR. Maintain VFR at all times. When a request for transmission is received, press your microphone button for the specified number of seconds.
there should be no more than 1 minute between transmissions. More frequent transmissions may be necessary depending on wind and your distance from the DF facility. The flight service station can also determine your approximate distance from the station by having you turn perpendicular to your inbound course, then timing you for 1 minute. A simple formula, which will be discussed later, allows them to compute your distance. When you're reoriented, FSS will inform you that the service is terminated.
Warrior 81312, DF service terminated.
You're encouraged to practice DF steers in VFR weather conditions, so if the service is ever needed, it won't be new to you. In addition, FSS welcomes the practice. In an actual emergency, the FSS specialist may coordinate with an air route traffic control center or even have you contact that facility for radar service. After you contact ATC, the first thing they will try to do is establish positive identification. In order to do this, they may ask you to climb above the minimum vectoring altitude. This altitude ensures terrain clearance and a reliable signal for the controller. Next, they'll have you adjust your transponder to a specified code. If you're declaring an emergency, ATC will probably ask you to squawk Mayday on 7700. After you've been identified, you may be asked to switch from the emergency code to some other code. This cancels the alarm in the radar facility. The controller will then provide the direction of the turn and a magnetic heading to fly to the airport, fix, or airway. If you don't understand the instructions, clarify them with the controller. When you reach your destination, the controller will indicate that radar service is terminated and instruct you to resume squawking VFR on 1200. If you're unable to get a DF steer or radar vectors, try to reorient yourself using your navigational equipment. You may even want to consider this option before calling a flight service station or center facility. To determine your position, you need to use 2 different nav aids and obtain a crossfix. This can be 2 VORs, 2 NDBs, or 1 of each. You can also determine your position by finding the direction and distance you are from a nav aid. Let's work through an example of a crossfix using an NDB and a VOR. First, maintain straight and level flight and align the heading indicator with the magnetic compass. Then, locate a nav aid on your aeronautical chart that is close to your last known position or your estimated position. In this case, let's use Kessel VOR. Tune in the frequency. Be sure all switches are in the proper position, then turn up the volume and identify the nav aid by listening to the Morse code. When you've identified the nav aid, center the course deviation indicator, or CDI, with a from indication. The radial you're on can be read at the top. In this case, it's the 155-degree radial. This is your line of position, so plot it on your aeronautical chart. Turn and track this radial inbound to the VOR. This requires you to reposition the OBS so the CDI is centered with a to indication. Now locate another nav aid, preferably one that is almost perpendicular to your current course. In this case, let's use the Dorcas NDB. As before, make sure you tune and identify the station. Note the relative bearing and add this to your magnetic heading to calculate the magnetic bearing to the station. Your line of position from the NDB is the reciprocal of the magnetic bearing to the station. Plot this line on your aeronautical chart. Your approximate position is the intersection of these 2 lines. You can then plot a new course to your destination, or you can intercept your previously planned route. With distance measuring equipment, or DME, you can tune in the nearest VOR, DME, or VORTAC, and follow the previous steps to find the radial from the station. Then determine your distance from the station by using the DME. plot that distance along the radial to find your position. If you're fortunate enough to have LORAN, you can identify your present position by reading the latitude and longitude on the display and then locating your position on the aeronautical chart. If you don't have LORAN or DME and only one nav aid is available, you can still find your location by estimating the distance from the nav aid. To do this, again check your directional gyro against your magnetic compass. Then tune and identify the station. And determine what radial you're on. Then turn to a heading 80 degrees right or left of the inbound course and rotate the OBS opposite the direction of the turn to the next 10-degree increment. For example, suppose you started on the 180-degree radial from the VOR and your heading is 360 degrees. If you turn right to 080 degrees, you would rotate the OBS left to identify the 170-degree radial. When the CDI centers, start a timer. Maintain your heading as accurately as possible and rotate the OBS another 10 degrees in the same direction as before. This allows you to identify the 160-degree radial. When the CDI centers again, note the elapsed time and apply it to the following formula. Distance from the VOR equals the true airspeed multiplied by the minutes flown divided by the degrees of bearing change. This is the same formula used by the FSS specialist to determine your location during a DF steer. Our example works out to be 18 nautical miles. This procedure is known as the wingtip bearing change method. Although it's not completely accurate because wind is not taken into account, it does give you an approximate distance from the VOR. You can also use this procedure with an NDB. If the previously mentioned methods prove unsuccessful, you'll have to locate your position using pilotage and dead reckoning. In a no-wind situation, calculate a time, speed, and distance problem using your true airspeed and the elapsed time since crossing your last known fix. For example, suppose your true airspeed is 128 knots, and you've been flying for 14 minutes. Your position should be approximately 30 nautical miles from the last known fix, in the direction you've been flying. However, if there's a wind, you'll have to calculate a circle of error. The center of this circle is your approximate position in a no-wind situation. You must then calculate the radius of the circle by multiplying the wind speed and the time flown. For example, if you estimate the wind speed at 20 knots, then the radius of this circle would be 5 nautical miles. Remember, the stronger the wind, the larger this circle becomes. So, to be sure you're located within the circle, do not underestimate the wind. Another method of finding yourself using pilotage is simply to turn toward the most prominent landmark or town and try to identify it on the map. Many water towers have the name of the town painted on the side. Or if there's an airport, the runway or taxiway may have the airport's name on it. If you're still lost and you've located an airport, you can always find out where you are by landing and asking. Don't let your pride get in the way of common sense. Remember, your best defense against getting lost is good pre-flight planning and constantly being aware of your position. In addition, you can also ask air traffic control to provide VFR flight following if their workload permits. Flight following is a service available to VFR pilots where ATC provides you with traffic advisories and other radar services such as vectors. However, this doesn't relieve you of your see and avoid responsibility. Getting lost can be an unnerving experience, But if you do get lost, keep a positive attitude and remain calm. Evaluate your situation and the resources available, including the weather and daylight, and fuel remaining. Then determine a course of action and follow it. Another stressful experience that you might have to deal with is an engine failure. Fortunately, engines don't fail very often. If your engine does fail, your chances of survival are greatly increased if you maintain control of the aircraft at a safe flying speed. Control and airspeed go hand in hand. Adequate airspeed allows for good control of the airplane, and good control of the airplane means establishing the appropriate airspeed, which, in a single-engine airplane, is the best glide speed. However, if you're going to attempt a restart, use the speed specified by the manufacturer. The best glide speed can be found in Section 3 of the Pilot's Operating Handbook, which addresses emergency procedures. Once you've established the proper airspeed, you should begin considering your options. These will vary depending on altitude, terrain, and the cause of the engine failure. Let's evaluate two situations to see how your options change with different conditions. First, consider a single-engine airplane en route at cruise altitude. After an engine failure, gradually increase pitch to hold altitude until best glide speed is reached. Trimming for this airspeed helps you control the airplane while concentrating on other duties. While you're establishing best glide speed, begin looking for a place to land. Make sure you look directly below and on both sides of the airplane. There might be a suitable landing site hidden by parts of the airplane, particularly if it's a low-wing airplane. When you've chosen a landing area, head for it. Don't overestimate the glide capabilities of your airplane. It makes no sense to abandon a hard-packed field and try to make it to an airport if the airplane will not glide that far. Knowing your airplane's glide characteristics is important. For example, if your cruise altitude is approximately 1 mile above the ground and your glide ratio is 11:1, you'll glide approximately 11 miles in ideal conditions. However, factors such as a headwind, pilot technique, and maneuvering can severely decrease this distance. If time permits after you've established best glide and are heading toward your chosen field, attempt a restart. Some common problems which can possibly be corrected include failure of an engine-driven fuel pump, carburetor ice, or running a fuel tank dry when the other tank still has fuel in it. The restart checklist in your pilot's operating handbook or approved flight manual can help you identify these and other problems. If a restart attempt doesn't prove successful, you must prepare for a landing. To reduce the risk of fire or further damage during an off-airport landing, follow manufacturers' recommendations in shutting down and securing the airplane. Common items include turning off the fuel, pulling the mixture to the idle cutoff position, and turning off the magneto switches. This helps eliminate the fuel and ignition source that start most fires. Electrical power should be left on to power flaps, landing gear, and radios, but shut off prior to touchdown when these items are no longer needed. When it comes to communicating your position, there are several things to consider. If you wait to communicate until you have attempted a restart and shut down the engine, you'll have lost altitude, which means sacrificing reception range. On the other hand, if you communicate immediately after you establish best glide, you may cause a lot of panic only to have the engine restart after you switch fuel tanks. More importantly, though, the time spent communicating means you're losing altitude in which to take action and set up for a landing. Remember, you should always aviate, navigate, and then communicate. Conserve as much altitude as you can until directly over your selected field. Then spiral down over the field to lose altitude. During the spiral, check for obstacles and terrain features such as power lines, fences, tree stumps, or ditches. If the field turns out to be unsuitable, you might still have enough altitude to select another site. As you pass through 2,000 feet AGL, you should have a field selected and begin concentrating on the approach. Since you don't have power, you must adjust your glide path and airspeed by varying pitch and managing drag devices such as landing gear and flaps. If you're high, lowering the nose will steepen your glide path and decrease induced drag, resulting in a higher airspeed. Another way to lose altitude, especially if you don't have flaps or the flaps are not working, is to slip the aircraft. However, some manufacturers warn against slips when flaps are extended because of the disruption of airflow over the elevator. To adjust your speed, you can extend the landing gear or lower flaps. This increases drag and slows the airplane down. When you extend gear and flaps, be careful not to extend them all at once. This will drastically increase drag and could cause you to land short. If you're too low but above the recommended glide speed, pitching the nose up will shallow the approach. Remember, increasing the pitch attitude increases induced drag. So if you're at or below the best glide speed, increasing the pitch attitude will actually steepen the approach. This is why you should never try to stretch a glide. The only way to achieve the maximum glide distance is to hold the best glide speed. Delay the extension of landing gear and flaps until you're sure you can make it to your chosen landing spot. This helps prevent you from getting too low on the approach. Wind can also affect your gliding distance. For instance, calm or light headwind conditions allow you to glide farther than strong headwinds. If possible, keep this in mind when setting up for the landing. In light winds, you would plan the base farther away from the field than in strong wind. When you're maneuvering for an emergency landing, make the pattern as close to normal as possible and complete the turn to final at or above 300 feet AGL. This allows you to stabilize the approach and ensure a wings level descent to touchdown at the slowest possible ground speed with a minimum of float. While an en route engine failure usually gives you time to make decisions and provides you with several choices of landing sites and approach paths, an engine failure at low altitude doesn't provide these options. Therefore, when approaching an airport to land, keep the airport within gliding distance whenever possible, without conflicting with local traffic pattern practices or AIM recommendations. On the departure phase, this may be more difficult. An engine failure immediately after takeoff can be a challenge. The time to prepare for this challenge is not when it happens. You should have a plan of action ready and be familiar enough with it so you can execute it quickly and efficiently. When your engine fails on departure, airspeed is crucial. On takeoff, you normally climb at the best rate of climb airspeed, or VY. The nose-high attitude provides a lot of lift and a lot of induced drag. When the engine quits, a large pitch change is necessary to conserve airspeed. Remember, your chances of survival are high if you do nothing more than immediately pitch for the best glide and land straight ahead at as slow an airspeed as possible in controlled flight. Despite the temptation, it's normally a mistake to try returning to the runway. Descent rate, winds, stall speed, and possibly surrounding terrain are all against you. Many light airplanes will lose 400 to 800 feet in a gliding 180-degree turn. However, this loss will probably be greater due to reaction time and the fact that more than 180 degrees is needed to get aligned with the runway. Generally, it is better to land straight ahead. The only maneuvering you should do is to avoid objects. Use flaps and gear as necessary. Delay extending these devices until you're sure you can reach the desired touchdown point. Whether you're en route or in the pattern, it is much more desirable to prevent an engine failure than to deal with one. Plan fuel stops conservatively and be willing to divert when unforecast winds slow you down and require you to stop sooner. Remember, improper fuel management is one of the most common causes of engine failures. Don't let it happen to you. In addition, observe manufacturers' recommended maintenance procedures and overhaul times, as well as power plant limitations. Exceeding these limitations and recommendations may increase your risk of an unnecessary engine failure. If the engine does quit and an airport is not within reach, you'll have to make an off-airport landing. Many factors should be considered when choosing an off-airport landing site. Since a field that looked good from the air may turn out to be unacceptable, try to choose several fields all within gliding distance and narrow them down as you get lower. Choose a field that most resembles an airport: long, flat, and hard-packed. In addition, consider the wind direction. Your goal is to touch down with the lowest possible speed, and landing into the wind will help achieve this goal. Whenever possible, always land on hard surfaces. This allows you to control the airplane. It also reduces the chance that the airplane will dig in and flip over. You also want to consider the slope of the landing site. It might be better to land with a tailwind if the ground slopes up, rather than into a headwind on downsloping terrain. When the emergency site is a cultivated field, land with the furrows instead of perpendicular to them. This will help prevent the airplane from nosing over. In light winds, obstacles and terrain features may dictate that you approach with a crosswind or small tailwind. This allows you to use as much of the field as possible instead of using up landing space during the approach. There are several things you can do during the approach, touchdown, and rollout to increase your chances of surviving a forced landing. Let's look at a few of these. One thing is to know your airplane. Emergency procedures, handling characteristics, and airspeeds should be memorized and practiced so you'll have the knowledge and skill to handle unforeseen problems. During the approach, you and your passengers should move the seats back as far as possible without sacrificing aircraft control, and tighten your seat belts and harnesses. This will help prevent injuries during the landing. If the landing is going to take place on a soft surface, it is advisable to leave the gear up. This keeps the wheels from digging in and helps prevent the possibility of the airplane nosing over. Position the doors as recommended by the manufacturer. Some designs rely on doors for structural integrity and others do not. Remember to slow down in the air. Touching down with the slowest possible ground speed means that it will take less distance to stop, and a lower ground speed results in lower overall impact forces. Touch down in a wings level, nose-high attitude, keeping the nose off the ground as long as possible. This helps prevent the nose from digging into the ground. And remember to always remain in control of the airplane. The landing is not over until the aircraft comes to a stop. When the airplane stops, get out as quickly as possible. If you're carrying passengers, it's your responsibility to brief passengers on emergency exits and how to operate them. This should be done before every flight. Flying over large bodies of water requires additional considerations. For one thing, even though regulations don't require it except in operations for hire, you should carry flotation devices for each passenger and have on board a life raft and other survival equipment necessary to support everybody until help arrives. Be sure you and your passengers have easy access to this equipment and that their flotation devices are on well before you have to ditch. If you have to land on water, try to do it near a surface vessel. This way, help is nearby. You should also be familiar with ditching procedures. A successful ditching depends on three things: sea conditions and wind, the type of aircraft you're flying, and your skill and technique. When evaluating sea conditions, remember that a wave is caused by local winds. A swell is a condition of the surface caused by a distant disturbance and may or may not be moving in the direction of the local wind. When approaching a swell, the side toward you is referred to as the swell face. This definition applies regardless of the direction of swell movement. Knowing these definitions and applying them to a ditching is imperative. Landing into the wind without consideration for swells is extremely dangerous. If a ditching is inevitable, try to land parallel to the swells with as much headwind as possible. Try to avoid landing into the face of the swell. The best place to land is on the crest, but landing in the trough will work almost as well. When determining wind direction, note the appearance of whitecaps and foam, and observe the wind streaks which parallel the wind. During the approach, observe the surface of the sea. Avoid shadows which indicate rough seas. Aim for lightly shaded areas where whitecaps and shadows aren't so prevalent. Remember, it will only take about 500 feet to come to a stop. Now let's look at some other factors you must consider when ditching. You may or may not have power available during a ditching. If you're sure you can't reach the coast and a ditching is inevitable, it is better to do it with power. If power is available during the approach, fly low over the water and maintain an airspeed 10 knots above the stall. When a smooth stretch of water appears, reduce power to idle and touch down at the recommended speed. When the surface is smooth, or at night, it will be hard to judge your height above the water. In this case, carry enough power to maintain a pitch attitude of 9 to 12 degrees nose up, and fly at an airspeed 10 to 20% above stall until contact is made with the water. If power isn't available, use a higher than normal approach speed so you can break the glide early and more gradually. This gives you more time and distance to feel for the surface, while decreasing the possibility of stalling or flying into the water. After touchdown, there is often little you can do to control the airplane. If control surfaces remain intact, attempt to keep the nose above the horizon by using rapid and positive control inputs. Once the airplane has come to a stop, evacuate as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, after an emergency, you still have responsibilities to fill. NTSB Part 830 outlines definitions and procedures to follow for reporting mishaps. When an accident or incident occurs, you must immediately notify the nearest NTSB field office by the most expeditious means available. An accident is an occurrence in which any person suffers death or serious injury, or substantial damage was done to the aircraft. An incident is an occurrence other than an accident which affects, or could affect, the safety of operations. Some examples of incidents are flight control system malfunction or failure, inability of a flight crew member to perform his normal flight duties due to injury or illness, an in-flight fire or collision, damage to property other than the aircraft estimated to exceed $25,000, and an aircraft that is overdue and believed to have been involved in an accident. A written report must be filed within 10 days after an accident or within 7 days if an overdue aircraft is still missing. A report on the incidents outlined in Part 830.5 only needs to be filed if the NTSB requests it. You, as the pilot, won't make these reports unless you're the operator of the aircraft. An operator is any person who causes or authorizes the operation of an aircraft. This may be the owner, lessee, or bailee of the aircraft. If you're not the operator, You'll, at the very least, have to provide a statement of the facts, conditions, and circumstances related to the accident or incident. The report filed with the NTSB must include the type and registration of the aircraft, the name of the owner and operator, the name of the pilot in command, the date and time of the accident, and other information outlined in NTSB Part 830.6. Finally, Subpart C specifies the actions that the operator of an aircraft must take to preserve the wreckage, cargo, mail, and records of an aircraft involved in an accident or incident. Reporting your accident or incident is important. The NTSB doesn't have the power to fine or violate you. They're an impartial, independent government agency whose sole purpose is to improve safety in the national transportation system. To do this, they depend on accurate and prompt reports of accidents and incidents. No one likes to imagine being lost or having an engine failure. But if an emergency arises, your skill and knowledge will determine the outcome. Knowing your airplane is very important. In an actual emergency, you might not have the time to review the POH. You are the most important system on the airplane. Reviewing emergency procedures and practicing them often will increase your chances of surviving a VFR emergency.